you, Lynn, for that very kind and generous introduction, and for mentioning JPOS, the Japanese Politics Online Seminar Series. You can sign up for the list if you're interested in Japanese politics, and everybody's welcome to attend. It's like a Zoominar with work in progress. And we have gotten up to 130 people in different sessions attending from all around the world. And so it's very much open and inviting atmosphere. This project is related to some of my previous work with a little bit of a twist. So as Len mentioned, a lot of my projects are about how individuals who come from different backgrounds or have different occupations or political histories, coming from a political dynasty, or women, young people get elected into office, and what kinds of policies that they put into place. So we might think of that as descriptive representation, people who look like the voters that they're going to represent actually being in politics. This project is thinking about policy representation. So are voters voting for parties who are proposing the kinds of policies that they want? So what is the connection between voters' policy preferences and their vote choices in Japanese elections? And it begins with a major puzzle in Japanese politics that also happens to be a broad comparative politics puzzle. And Japan is like the best case to understand this issue, and that's single party dominance. So dominant parties have been an enduring puzzle in comparative politics for various reasons in the comparative study of democracy. If you have competitive elections, you would anticipate that occasionally the party in power gets ousted from power, that the rascals get thrown out the window if they're doing a bad job, or that there's some kind of competition over alternative visions for a country. If the same party keeps winning elections, it raises the questions of whether those elections are really fulfilling the voters' demands and accurately representing their preferences. So a famous quote from Adam Jaworski at NYU is that democracy is a system in which parties lose elections. If parties never lose elections, is there something going on that's maybe problematic? This goes back to Giovanni Sartori in the 1970s, was writing about dominant party systems as one in which the major party is consistently supported by a winning majority of voters. So this idea that voters are consistently in free and fair elections, not through corruption or other means, returning the same party to office. It's not just Japan that has a dominant party, but the LDP in Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party, is probably has the best record comparatively for party dominance. So when it was founded in 1955, up until 1993, it held the government, oftentimes with a single party majority, most often with a single party majority. It was out of office for just 10 months between 1993 and 1994. And then it was back in office until 2009, this time in coalition, but as the dominant member of the coalition. And then it was out of office again for 3 years between 2009 and 2012. If you're taking Professor Choppa's class, you probably learned a little bit about that. And since 2012 has been back in power with a vengeance, with a huge 60% plus majority of seats. If we look around the world, you have the PRI in Mexico that was dominant for a long time, but the elections in that period of dominance were hardly free and fair. There was corruption, vote buying, intimidation, and so on. The Christian Democrats in Italy were also a famous dominant party, but that party imploded after corruption scandals in the 1990s. It no longer exists. In Sweden, there's the Social Democrats who have been in government for many years of Sweden's history, but with different breaks, and also always in coalition. The Liberals in Canada oftentimes control the government at the federal level, but they're by no means dominant throughout the country. You have the Indian National Congress in India, which used to be dominant, but in recent years has largely been supplanted by the BJP in terms of its dominance. And the leader of the Congress Party, Rahul Gandhi, was recently expelled from the Lok Sabha. And then in Africa, you have the ANC and the BDP in Botswana. These are kind of single party regimes that have dominated politics since the independence of those countries. And then you have the People's Action Party in Singapore, but there again, it's not necessarily free and fair competitive environment for parties. So the LDP kind of stands out as this peculiar dominant party in free and fair elections around the world. The question is why? There have been a lot of various explanations in the political science literature for understanding party dominance, and also why voters support parties in general. And a classic model of voter behavior is called the spatial model of voting. If we think about ideology as being a spectrum from left to right, you look at the parties that are proposing different policies and you consider which policies are closest to your preferences as a voter, and you select the party that's closest to you. And so traditional spatial models of voter competition or voting behavior struggle to explain why a party like the LDP would continue to win election after election, because other parties can see what voters like, and they could move towards those voters' positions. They could even adopt the exact same positions as the LDP. And then there's a question of what is the LDP winning those elections on the basis of, if it's not policy. Okay. There should be some kind of rotation in policy positioning among parties, and the ability for parties in particular to appeal to independent voters or those who don't have a strong partisan affiliation. That's not happening in dominant party systems. And so these traditional models may be struggling to explain support for dominant parties based on policy positioning alone. The solution in this literature to what's happening is that there's something else that contributes to support for a party. So if it's not just policy, what is it? And spatial models of voting in political science have introduced the concept of valence. It's kind of a fancy term, but it basically just means a non-policy attribute. You can think of like trustworthiness or charisma or competence that is not connected specifically to policy positions, but is more about the quality of a party and what voters can expect from it. Okay? So this was introduced as a way of solving this kind of lack of stability potential in policy voting in democracies. This is summarized very succinctly by recent work by Calvo and Murillo. So if two parties offer the exact same policy, but one of them has a non-policy advantage, valence, shouldn't voters opt for the more competent on election day? So valence may be a way of solving this problem of spatial competition in terms of policy and why dominant parties do well. The implications are that dominant parties may have a valence advantage over the opposition, and they can flexibly adapt their policies. So they can adopt different positions as voters change their preferences, and they'll still win votes based on this valence advantage, that they have this advantage over the opposition. That's the basic story of why dominant parties may be able to succeed. And it leaves other parties in the opposition to take extreme or niche positions, to not moderate their positions and try to appeal to the moderate voters or the median voters. So our goal is to kind of consider whether this framework from general comparative politics of voting behavior applies to the case of Japan. So we have this party, the LDP, that consistently wins elections. Is it winning elections because voters like its policies? Or is it winning elections because voters are choosing based on valence, something else that's not related to policy? Put this more succinctly, our research question in this project is, to what extent can voters' support for the LDP be attributed to policy versus valence? Okay. Does this sound maybe sort of simple or straightforward? It should be pretty easy to assess. Well, I thought maybe a good face validity check of this research question would be to ask ChatGPT if they could solve this question. So I put, before coming here, I put this question into ChatGPT. To what extent can voters support the LDP, or can it be attributed to the LDP versus policy preferences versus valence advantages? And ChatGPT, this is raw. I didn't document this. This is what ChatGPT told me. There's no clear consensus on the extent to which voters' support for the LDP can be attributed to their policy preferences versus valence advantages. However, there are several factors that may influence Japanese voters' support for the LDP. First, the LDP has a long history of governing Japan and is widely perceived as a stable and reliable party. This is like a competence kind of explanation. That would be valence, right? This valence advantage may be particularly important to Japanese voters who prioritize stability and continuity of government. Second, the LDP has traditionally been associated with conservative and nationalist ideologies, which resonates with voters who prioritize issues like national security and traditional values. This is policy. So if the LDP is proposing policies that are conservative or nationalistic, conservative on security issues and so on, and voters like those policies, some of those voters may be supporting the LDP for policy reasons. Third, the LDP has historically been successful in delivering policies that address the needs of specific interest groups, farmers and small businesses. So this is a kind of clientelism argument. So if you've taken Mr. Shalva's class, I'm sure this has come up in your lectures there, with the idea that the LDP is going to be bringing benefits like pork barrel benefits to districts that support the support the party. That's a form of policy voting, but it's tied to particularistic benefits rather than kind of high-level programmatic policies. But then ChatGPT goes on to say there are also indications policy preferences may be an important factor. The LDP has been successful at policies addressing demographic challenges like aging population. I don't know if this is true, but this is what ChatGPT.
I have read my article.
Yeah. Overall, this is where I think we're on pretty good footing for a research question. Overall, the relationship between policy preferences and valence advantages in shaping that and voters' support for the LDP is complex and multifaceted. While valence advantages such as stability and reliability may be important to some voters, policy preferences may also play a role in shaping voter behavior. So this is great news for the job security of political scientists. Yeah. We don't need ChatGPT to solve all of our problems. So our substantive contribution with this project is to move beyond some Japan-specific explanations for LDP dominance to situate the case in this broader framework of voting behavior from comparative politics. We also make a methodological contribution, which I won't go into too much detail in this paper, but we're using a novel experimental, in this presentation, it's a novel experimental approach to estimate policy preferences through what's called a conjoint experiment. And I'll explain in very simple terms how this works. Our key empirical findings, just to highlight these at this point, is that policy preferences can only partially explain support for the LDP in Japan. The LDP wins elections despite the fact that as we measure it, their package of policies that they propose to voters in elections is actually the least popular package of policies. So if you ask voters about policies in the abstract without attaching a party label to it, the policies that the LDP supports are the least popular package of policies, but they win up to 60% of the seats. There's a little bit of a disconnect here. Many voters still support the LDP despite preferring the policy packages offered by the main opposition parties. So what accounts for this gap? We argue that the LDP has a valence advantage over the opposition, and we try to decompose what this valence advantage is based on. Why do voters trust the LDP more, support the LDP more? And the argument that we arrive on is it's trust. So it's an idea that the LDP has greater trust of voters. And just to highlight, what may be coming, that may be at risk currently in contemporary events because the LDP is facing a number of corruption scandals at the moment, and the prime minister's support rate has gone down to 16%. So that trust is not necessarily something the LDP can take for granted. So if the LDP loses that trust of voters and they don't have popular policies, it may be the recipe for them to lose seats in future elections. Those are the implications. So the LDP dominance should not be attributed to voter support for its policies. Also, parties with a valence advantage like the LDP can deviate from voters' preferences without risk of losing elections. And this is in the political science literature, a bit of a reevaluation of how dominant parties and opposition parties position themselves. Okay, if you're familiar with Japanese politics, I hope you are because you're here, you've taken Professor Shafa's class. I don't have to spend too much time on explaining the LDP or Japan, but obviously I think Japan is a really interesting and important case to understand. It's the third world, well, it was just passed by Germany. It's now the fourth largest economy in the world. It may recover that status as the third largest economy in the world, but it's the 11th most populous country. It's been a stable democracy since the end of World War II. It has free and fair elections, vibrant voter participation, multi-party competition, and a multidimensional policy space. So there's lots of different things that parties can appeal to voters on the basis of. And there's low levels of partisanship. About 60% of voters don't support any party. So they declare that they're kind of independent or floating voters. And if you have that share of voters, think about in the United States, how little room there is to appeal to like swing voters. You're either a diehard Republican or a diehard Democrat. And they're kind of chasing that vanishingly small number of independents in each district. In Japan, you have 60% of voters who are up for grabs. You should be able to appeal to them based on policy proposals. And so the fact that the LDP is winning despite not having popular policies means that there's an interesting story here with what is appealing to these 60% of voters that aren't like diehard LDP partisans. This is a puzzle. You have effectively a one-party regime despite these conditions that should make party turnover more likely. This is just a picture of recent LDP and not so recent LDP prime ministers putting roses on the board next to candidates who win in elections. I don't know why In Japan, you put a rose on a board next to the name if they win elections. I've been asking every time I hear this talk to historians, if anybody knows why the tradition developed of putting roses on the board. It goes at least back to the 60s and 50s. And there's no real explanation for why it's a rose, but it continues to this day. This is sort of a stickiness of institutions. Since it was founded in 1955, the LDP has controlled government with only two exceptions, as I mentioned, 1993, 1994. And then 2009 to 2012. It has won a majority or a plurality in 21 out of 22 general elections. It's held a share of seats twice that of any other party in 15 out of 22 elections. And in the most recent 4 elections, it's gotten more than 60% of the seats. And this is all despite an electoral reform in the 1990s that was supposed to introduce regular alternation in power. It's so far only introduced that once in 2009. So there was an expectation that under the current electoral rules, there would be regular alternation in power, but the LDP has returned to dominance since 2012. These conditions, we argue, make Japan an ideal case for studying the role of voters in policy preferences for sustaining dominant parties like the LDP. Let's look at the current existing explanations for LDP dominance. You probably covered some of these in class if you took Professor Schapa's class. There are lots of them. So one explanation is the opposition is fragmented. So on the right side of the ideological spectrum, you have the LDP mostly capturing voter support. On the left side, you've got a bunch of different parties that are maybe chasing the same voters and splitting the anti-LDP vote, especially in the context of single-member districts where you win by being the plurality winner. So if the opposition is split and divided, they might have more votes collectively, but if they split those across many parties, then they lose that election and the LDP can win with a plurality of votes rather than a majority of votes. That's one explanation. Another explanation is their electoral alliance with a small religious party called Komeito. So in exchange for being in a coalition with Komeito, the LDP gets the support of Komeito voters who aren't running a candidate in their districts. There's an estimate that's about 25,000 voters in some districts, and so it's not chump change. They get some support on the ground from Komeito supporters. In exchange, Komeito gets to be part of the coalition with the LDP and has some access to power. A third explanation is more closely tied to the idea of policy voting, which is flexible adaptation. But over time, the LDP has been a creative conservative party, not a sort of rigid conservative party. In the 70s, they introduced environmental protections, welfare expansion, and so on. These are all policies that you wouldn't traditionally associate with a conservative party. And so the idea is that the LDP maybe is flexible enough as a catch-all party to appeal to voters as their preferences change. Fourth explanation is this idea of clientelism and an organized vote, that the LDP, because it controls the government, controls the piggy bank, and that piggy bank can be used to favor different districts. And in exchange, those districts maybe will support the LDP or interest groups in those districts. And so the LDP's control over the Japanese government's finances helps them to create a virtuous cycle of support among voters. We don't reject any of these explanations as being wrong, but they've overlooked the role of policy to an extent. And we think that the flexible adaptation explanation in particular doesn't have any empirical basis. Nobody's really tested it in terms of whether voters support the policies that the LDP is proposing or not. And so our focus in this project is to actually test this, whether the LDP wins elections because voters like its policies. Pretty straightforward question. It turns out to be a difficult question. So it's not a very easy thing to measure. So you could ask voters, do you like Article 9 of the Constitution, that it's a so-called peace clause that says Japan won't have a military for the purposes of war? And you could then say, which party do you support? They might say LDP, or they might say another party. You could ask the same voter, do you support separate surnames, rights for separate surnames of married couples? Right now in Japan, men and women who get married have to pick a single surname. And in 95% of the cases, it's the one who uses her family name and adopts the husband's name. But you support same-sex marriage and other social issues. You could ask voters these question by question kind of issue positions. Then there's a question of how do you aggregate those to a party choice? Parties, turns out, represent bundles of policy. When you're voting in democracies, we don't have a direct democracy where you choose issue by issue. You choose among parties that are representing bundles of issues. Parties are aggregating these issues and giving a package to voters at election time. So voters have to trade off which issues they think are more important or less important in their vote choice. And maybe they'll support a party that has positions they like on 75% of the policy issues of the day, but on 25% of the issues, they don't like that party. Or maybe they're single issue voters and they're looking for that one position from a party that speaks to their main concerns. It's a complicated process of representative democracy. We don't have sort of issue by issue, a la carte elections. Existing studies that try to measure this will often use ideological self-placement. So you ask voters, where would you put yourself on a left-right scale? And then which party would you vote for? And you lose a lot of information about that kind of self-placement in those kinds of self-placement scales. It's not really capturing the multidimensional nature of these policy packages. So our solution in this paper, and in the paper you can find it online, it goes into technical details about how we do this. But for the purposes of this presentation, we use an experimental technique called conjoint analysis, where we're jointly estimating preferences for a bundle of policy positions. That's how elections happen in the world, as I mentioned. So parties at election time present voters with manifestos. Since 2003 in Japan, parties have published these kinds of manifestos. These are the main parties. They have some slogan, and inside each of these documents, you'll have various policy positions laid out. Not too many. Parties typically will focus on about 5 or so main policies, and they'll explain to voters what their position on those policies is. Typically, they're the most important issues of the day. So in the United States, maybe immigration is a big issue that'll come up in the 2024 campaign. These are from the 2017 election, where consumption tax increase was a big issue of the election campaign, whether to increase the consumption tax from 8% to 10%. So this is the party manifesto of the Party of Hope, and they're telling their position on the consumption tax. They don't want to increase it to 10%. They're also giving their position on post-Abenomics policies, so economic policies. They're giving their position on nuclear power. This is in the context of the 2011 nuclear meltdown in Fukushima, a hotly debated issue in Japanese politics. They have their position on some regional local issues. This is a center-left party, the Constitutional Democratic Party of Japan. They're also giving their positions on various issues of the day. So parties are releasing these sort of short form versions of their packages. Newspapers are also providing this kind of information to voters. So if you're a voter in Japan, and you open up a newspaper during election time, you might see a table like this. This is from the Yomiuri Shimbun, the newspaper with the largest circulation, not just in Japan, but in the world. It's sort of a center right newspaper. And this is from the 2021 election. You have 6 parties listed here in the left column, and 3 policy issues in the subsequent column. So there's coronavirus policy, economic policy, and diplomacy policy. And the newspaper has given a succinct description of what the party's position is on those policy issues. And so voters can then look at this kind of table and figure out which policies they care most about, which party's position has, which party's policy manifesto has the position that they prefer most. And that'll help them make up their choice over who to vote for in the election. So we took inspiration from this kind of way of displaying policy information to voters. And we created in a survey experiment a similar table comparison for voters. So we asked respondents, these are Japanese voters in the time of an election campaign, suppose these 2 parties were running candidates in their campaign, which would you be more likely to support? We have party 1 and party 2, and we have the main issues of the campaign. We did this in 2017 and 2021. This is from 2021. The main issues were nuclear power, diplomacy, diversity. This is things like same-sex marriage and surnames for married couples, coronavirus policy, and economic policy. And then we took the actual policy positions from the party's actual policy manifestos published in the campaign, and we randomized them in this table. So we populated these hypothetical parties with the actual policies of the parties running in the campaign, but randomized. And then we asked voters, which of these hypothetical parties would you support? And because we use the actual policies of the parties, we can use this to kind of back out and estimate the preferences for the real manifestos of those parties if they were presented to the voters rather than these hypothetical manifestos. I'll just quickly show some of the LDP's policies from 2021. So on coronavirus, they wanted to disseminate oral medicine by the end of the year. On nuclear power, they wanted to restart nuclear power plants whose safety has been confirmed. They had some kind of boilerplate vague language about promoting understanding of LGBT issues, but they were the only party that opposed same-sex marriage or civil unions, and they were the only party that opposed separate surnames for married couples. So they're kind of out of step with the rest of the parties, and also with Japanese voters, 75% of voters support these issues, but the LDP doesn't. That's what the design is based on. We sampled voters in 2017 and 2021, several thousands of them. We used quotas in our sampling strategy so that our sample of voters in this experiment would be similar to the population of voters in the country across gender, age, income, and region. And then in 2021, we had 2 additional experiments. So let me explain this process. In 2017, we first asked some demographic questions for quotas. We asked gender, age, and so on. Then we had the conjoint experiment where they were choosing between these 2 hypothetical profiles. And then we had political questions. So do you support the Abe government? Which party do you usually support? Did you turn out in the last election? Do you plan to turn out in this election, and so on? And then after the election, we followed up with the same voters in a second wave and asked them if they did turn out to vote and who they voted for. In 2021, we had the same design, but after asking them about this hypothetical comparison of manifestos, we randomly allocated each of the respondents to one of 2 groups. And they both did the same set of exercises in these 2 groups, but in reverse order. So in one set of exercises, they were asked to choose their preferred party, but we put labels on there. We put LDP and we put some other party on there. So now voters had this signal of party label. And another one, they were asked to choose which hypothetical party seemed closest to the LDP. And this was designed to see if voters could kind of get a sense of which policies were more conservative or less conservative. Can voters identify conservative policies versus progressive policies? Here are the main results from the main first part of the experiment in both years. So on the left, you have 2017, and on the right, you have 2021. The line down the middle at 0 is the way you interpret this. We've set the LDP's position as a baseline, and all of the other parties' positions are in comparison to the LDP's position. So if the point estimates are close to the line, it means that voters did not have any preference about that policy position relative to the LDPs. They were indifferent. If you see a point estimate that's to the left of the line, that means that the LDP's policy on that issue was more popular. So presenting the positions of another party meant that a voter was less likely to choose that manifesto, that hypothetical manifesto, relative to one that had the LDP's position. Okay? If it's to the right, that means that the LDP's policy was less popular, meaning that a hypothetical profile that contained a position of one of the other parties was more likely to be chosen than a hypothetical profile that contained the position of the LDP. Okay, are we clear on that interpretation? So you can see right away that there are a lot of points to the right of 0, meaning that the LDP's actual position on the policy issue was less popular than the other parties' positions on those policy issues. There are some exceptions to that. So on foreign policy, the parties of the far left, the JCP especially, and on constitutional revision, the parties of the far left, their positions are less popular than the LDPs. So they're opposed to revising the Constitution to bring Article 9 up to speed with Japan's military reality. And they oppose the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance. And most voters support those or the more conservative and mainstream centrist parties' positions on that and oppose the far left's positions on it. So you can see that those are less popular than the LDPs. In 2021, Kometo's economic policies, which were cash handouts to families, were less popular than the LDPs. And again, the Communist Party's foreign policy was less popular than the LDPs. Otherwise, it's mostly shifted to the right, which means the LDP's positions were less popular. So we take these basic responses and we estimate through them a kind of aggregate, what we call a policy utility. So taking all of these responses, if we were to present these respondents with the actual manifesto of the LDP, what might their preferences be for that actual manifesto? This is a kind of computationally difficult thing, so I won't go into the details of it, but because we've got lots of respondents and they're doing lots of exercises, we can estimate their preferences at the individual level for each party's actual set of policies. And then we can investigate the relationship between this policy preference, holistic policy preference, and vote choice. Okay, all with me? So here's what we find. First, our measure has a pretty strong correlation with ideology and a correlation between parties who are on different sides of the ideological spectrum. This is what that shows. So it's pretty good summation of voters' true policy preferences, we argue. And then if we look at the distribution of these policy preferences, we find that the LDP has the lowest support among voters. So these are just histograms from 2017 and 2021. And we've set the LDP's position to be a mean of 0. If we look at the other parties, all of them, except for the case of Cometo in 2021, have more positive shifts. So there are more voters who like those parties' manifestos than they like the LDP's manifesto. Okay? This is an easier way to visualize it. So on the each row here is the share of respondents who support a given party. So 800 respondents in 2017, the JCP's bundle was their most preferred bundle.
Communist Party, just in case they don't know the initials.
Oh yeah, the Communist Party is the JCP. And then the cell is the share of those voters who actually supported the JCP in the election. So reported that they were going to vote for the JCP. And so in this cell, for example, only 14% of the voters who most preferred the communist policies reported voting for the Communist Party. If we look at the LDP, the first thing you notice is that very few of the respondents preferred the LDP's bundle the most, only 147. But 63% of those 147 also voted for the LDP. So there's a small number of voters who are voting correctly based on their policy interests for the LDP. There's a lot of voters who support other parties, so that the Kibo party is the most popular, but only 15% of those respondents who most preferred Kibo voted for Kibo. A lot of voters who are not voting their most preferred bundle. This is kind of a mismatch, right? So if you're not voting for the party who's providing the bundle that you most prefer in the abstract, what are you voting based on? So we took these policy, estimated policy preferences, and we put them into a model that says on the in the outcome side, which party you're going to vote for, and the independent variable that goes into that is your policy preferences for these parties' bundles. And we find that there's a positive relationship between these policy preferences and vote choice, but that the intercept for the LDP is much higher. So if you look at the zeros here, a voter who would be at the 0 here on policy preferences for the JCP has a very low probability of voting for the JCP. In contrast, a voter who's at the 0 position for the LDP still has about a 50% chance of voting for the LDP. And so this gap, this jump in probability of supporting a party, holding their policy preferences constant, guess what that is? We argue that's the valence. That's this valence component that's different from policy preferences. That's something that's non-policy related. That's explaining support for the LDP. I'll go through this really quickly. This is the part of the experiment where we asked which party seems more similar to the LDP. Voters are pretty good at capturing conservative parties. So all of these points are to the left, meaning that any manifesto, hypothetical manifesto that contains the positions that aren't the LDP, which is at the baseline here, voters are pretty good at saying that's not the LDP's, or that manifesto is not similar to the LDP. Okay, here's where things get interesting. So if we think that there's some partisanship and we want to know why do voters support the LDP if it's not based on their policy. The third experiment we did attached party labels to these hypothetical manifestos, and then we can see how does that shift people's preferences. So you have these hypothetical exercises where voters are choosing party 1 or party 2 with no party label. And this is going to measure their pure policy preferences. This is what we've seen so far. Now we took the exact same exercises and we showed them to the exact same respondents, but we attached party labels. LDP was always one of the party labels and another party was always the other one. And so because we showed them the exact same comparisons, we can look at which voters changed their preferences. So you liked one hypothetical party when it had no party label. And then suddenly when the LDP label is applied to the other hypothetical party, do you switch and you no longer care about the policies that were in the hypothetical manifesto, or do you keep voting based on your policies that you liked in the initial experiment? Does that make sense? Are we all on the same page? Okay. So we did this experiment, and then we can estimate changes within respondents. Who's shifting their preferences? Who's voting based on party label, not based on the policies that are contained under that label in these exercises. What we find is that across the board, any policy, even the extreme left party positions of the Communist Party on revising Article 9 and abolishing the US-Japan Security Alliance, if you attach the party label, there's a shift. So the blue dots here are when the label is attached, you get a shift in support. So voters are changing their preferences just towards the LDP party label. And the last column here shows the difference, the percentage point change. It's about 10 percentage points on average. So just applying the LDP party label increases the probability of that hypothetical manifesto being chosen by 10 percentage points across the board. So who's doing this switching? Maybe that'll help us understand like where the LDP support is coming from. If it's not based on policy, if it's about party label, what does that party label convey? Why would people be switching to the LDP if they don't necessarily like the party's policies? What are they switching for? So we thought about how we could decompose this based on these party switchers and looking at its association, the change in preferences, looking at the association to various characteristics of those voters and various characteristics of their districts. So if we think that there's some valence attributes like trust in the party leader or in the government or their perceived job performance or their whether they considered like local things like a clientelistic kind of explanation like benefits that are going to come to your local area, or if they say that they voted for the LDP based on policy considerations, maybe we weren't measuring some policy considerations in our manifesto experiment, and there's some other policies like opposition to China that weren't measured in our manifestos because they weren't explicitly said by the parties in the campaign. But maybe there are some voters who don't like China as an example, and they vote for the LDP because they think the LDP doesn't like China. But that wasn't a contested issue in the campaign. So we can include that in this decomposition. We also asked about the amount of fiscal transfers their district got. So is this a clientelistic story? Here's what we find. Overwhelmingly, the biggest predictor of these party switchers, so people who are going to support the LDP when the label is attached, but would not have supported that package of policies when the party label wasn't attached. It's because they had a high stated trust in the LDP. So the people who trust the LDP the most are most likely to disregard their policy preferences when they have a party label as a heuristic on which to make their choice. Other things like cabinet's job performance and COVID policy are also statistically significant, but much smaller than trust. And interestingly, things like the personal characteristics of candidates, the fiscal transfers received by a district, whether you care about local benefits or other policy issues, none of these are significant predictors of that shift. Trust is kind of standing out to us. And this is the raw data of what voters said their trust in the parties were. You can see that if you have a 4-point scale, quite trustworthy, somewhat trustworthy, not very trustworthy, mostly trustworthy, the LDP has an advantage across other parties in terms of those that view it at least somewhat trustworthy. The party that comes closest is Ishin, which is a party based in Kansai around Osaka. And incidentally, if we look just at Kansai, Ishin almost matches the LDP in trust, and they're basically getting this valence advantage that the LDP is getting in the rest of the country. Why? The Ishin is in charge of the governorship and mayor position in Osaka, and they were in charge of COVID-19 policy at the local level in 2021, and they were credited with handling that well. So voters were pleased with the competence of Ishin in Kansai, and they trusted Ishin more than they would trust the LDP in Kansai. But that's only a very localized decision. The rest of the country, people trust the LDP to run the government more than they trust the opposition. So sometimes research is best summarized with a cartoon. I think, and this one captures, I think, a takeaway of this, of our findings for this project. So you have voters at a restaurant in Japan considering their electoral options. They say, this one's iffy, that one's risky, this one's definitely not fresh. Yikes, not this one, I've never heard of that one. We'll take the LDP boilerplate. And the waiter says, what a surprise. So the argument that we're making in this project is not that the LDP is winning all of these elections because voters are happy with its policies and considering its policies and voting for it. It's that there's strong party label effects, and the party label is associated with trust or competence, stability in government. So voters are looking around at their array of options among the opposition, and they're kind of either holding their nose or they're kind of questioning whether those parties will perform well in government. And then in a sense, they're holding their nose and voting for the LDP, which they don't really like the policy positions of the LDP, but they don't think anything wildly terrible is going to happen under the LDP's stewardship of the government. The flip side of this is that the LDP's basis of support based on policy is very weak. If the opposition continues to not have that trust and voters are happy enough, the LDP can continue to be dominant in Japanese elections. But if the LDP loses the trust of voters, they don't have a solid basis of policy-based support in the electorate on which to win elections. And so there could be a volatile change in power again. And I say that because the recent news in Japanese politics is that the prime minister's support rate is now at 16%. There have been a bunch of corruption scandals involving the LDP. And that maybe that if an election were to be held now, that valence advantage that the LDP has, that trust advantage would have eroded. In the time of our survey experiment in 2021, the LDP was riding this high of having handled COVID-19 and having put out vaccines relatively fast. That gave them this valence advantage. But if the election were held today, we think that that valence advantage would be eroded. The LDP would be campaigning instead on its policies, and its policies are not very popular. So the other side of that is if the opposition, like Ishin and Kansai, were able to build up enough credibility and reputation for competence, then they could challenge the LDP on valence, where they're already proposing policies that voters like. They're already proposing the most popular package of policies. Moving beyond Japan, this has broader implications for how we think about democracy and also party competition and behavior. So our findings challenge a conventional wisdom in comparative politics of voting literature about how opposition parties will position themselves vis-a-vis a dominant party. The conventional wisdom is that if you have a dominant party, opposition parties will take niche or extreme positions. We're finding that the opposition parties are actually proposing popular policies. They're taking the positions that voters want, but they can't win the support of those voters because they don't have this valence advantage. This is similar in the United States to research that shows that politicians are largely out of step with their voters in terms of their policy extremism. Politicians in Congress and both parties have polarized, and they're more extreme in their views than their voters are. But they continue to be reelected because of polarization and because of the voters. Let's take as an example, Republican voters may be much more moderate than Republican politicians, but they don't want to vote for a Democrat, so they vote for an extreme Republican in their district, and you get this kind of disconnect between voters and their leaders. We argue that more research of this kind is needed to figure out like why these gaps emerge between voters' preferences and their policy and their party choices in democracies. And we think that Japan, as a country that has this dominant party, despite its lack of popularity and policies, is a window for understanding political behavior more generally. So I will end there, and I look forward to hearing your reactions and questions.
Thank you very much. So do you mind handling your own pointing out people?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, I think that we don't have a strong norm of graduate students go first or anything like that. So it's free for all. Anybody who has a question
Anything, I got
is
it.
welcome to ask.
I had a question about, thank you for this presentation. I thought this is really interesting material. So there is this sense of trust. I think you're doing a very good job of showing that valence is playing an integral role and that the policy analysis doesn't capture why the LDP would have this, long-standing dominance in electoral politics in Japan. How much of this do you think could be attributed to the sense of voters wanting to be aligned with the party in power?
Sort of a bandwagon effect.
The front running effect, like everybody changing their bumper stickers the day after the election in Washington.
Yeah. We didn't, if I go back to the components of this party label effect, we didn't ask anything about which party do you think will win. We could, so one could imagine the same research design where you have no party labels or party labels. And you ask voters, which of these parties do you think will be more popular? Which one will win? You can do this also with candidate attributes. You could have like, gender randomized, you could have experience randomized, education randomized, and ask which candidate looks more like or winnable or electable, and then put the LDP label on. Right. And I think if you put the LDP label on those, a lot of voters in Japan would say, yeah, the LDP candidate's more likely to win. And that may be part of why some voters support the LDP. But we can't disaggregate that in our data.
So just to add to some his question. You were doing this polling during 2 years in which everybody knew the LDP was going to win. So even though they didn't know the result, you're asking this before the election, there might have been some anticipatory, I don't want to be with the loser. I want to be with the winner. That's driving people to value the LDP label. So, but if you're right about that not being a factor, you could have done this in 2009 when everybody was predicting it was very, the LDP had a good chance of losing. People were genuinely uncertain about the outcome, and DPJ ended up winning in a landslide. If you had done the same project in 2009, do you think you would have seen?
I definitely would have seen much lower trust in the LDP.
Yeah.
And so trust and these kind of perceptions of probability of winning are probably endogenous in a sense. So the LDP in 2021, for those of you who were too young to remember this, or like in the haze of COVID, it's only 3 years ago. But up until August of 2021, the LDP was being severely criticized for its handling of the coronavirus. And the leader of the LDP, Prime Minister Suga, was doing poorly in public opinion polls. So at that time, there wouldn't have been that much of an expectation that it was going to be a landslide for the LDP. Some people thought the LDP was going to lose votes.
Right.
They changed party leaders a month before the election and switched out Suga for Kishida. And then just before the election, the vaccine was ready to roll out. And so there was this kind of coincidence of events just before the election that played to the LDP's advantage. But at the time, it wasn't foregone conclusion that the LDP was going to win 60% plus of the seat share. They could have been hurt by this. And yet we see that there was more trust in the LDP's ability to handle the coronavirus than there was in the opposition parties. And again, the key difference we find is in Kansai, where Ishin was in power. Ishin got that trust again, which is interesting. And I think it's very much in the context of COVID for 2021. We didn't do this part of the experiment in 2017, so we can't say for sure what's driving the Yeah.
If the LDP trust was to keep going down and they were to lose the next election, do you think that people would keep voting based on valence, or would their voting strategy suddenly shift to policy and the JCP would get a ton of votes?
I don't think the JCP will ever get a ton of votes. If I were the opposition and I were able to unseat the LDP once, and this was the DPJ's problem, I would change the electoral rules and make them more proportional. Japan has an electoral system for the lower house that is mostly majoritarian, single seat districts. And so you can have either, it's very hard to flip a seat if you don't get up to like a plurality in the district. But if you get just enough votes, and you can have wild swings, and there haven't been enough wild swings in Japanese politics. But a proportional representation system would provide more stability in parties' vote shares, so you don't have booms and busts the way that that you might if the opposition were able to gain power again, like they did in 2009. And my argument, and I tell this to my friends in Japan, but it's not up to me to change Japan's rules, is I think Japan is a multi-party society. The Communist Party is not going to go away. The NATO party is not going to go away. The LDP is not going to go away. And it's trying to squeeze a multi-party society into a two-party oriented system, a single member district system for them. And it'd be much healthier for politics if they had parties represented in proportion to their share of the population's preferences. That's kind of a wishful thinking. I don't think it'll happen. But if I were the opposition and I were able to get in power, I would change the rules, change the electoral rules to be multi-proportional, so that the next time there's an election, regardless of the LDP's valence, opposition parties wouldn't get crushed by small changes in their vote share.
How much do you think the trust in the system of perhaps maybe the fact that while the LDP has been the dominant party for the large majority of their democratic history, so while that trust is the basis of it, that voters might more rely on the fact that if a prime minister instead is unpopular, that the LDP stays the same, but they just kind of switch over to a prime minister that's perhaps has different policy standpoints and stuff than the previous one who would be very unpopular.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the LDP, this was hinted at in my earlier response about changing out Suga for Kishida. One of the ways that the LDP has used like prime ministerial selection, also cabinet reshuffling, is to present like a refreshed image of the cabinet. At this point, so Kishida kicked out a bunch of members of the cabinet who had money scandals in recent months. But when the money scandals are so pervasive, there sort of becomes a question, well, who's left to promote into the cabinet? So even if Kishida is not tainted by the scandal yet, it may be that the LDP as a party is, and it like that distinction is harder. But in general, the LDP and the prime minister's popularity can be detached. So a popular prime minister like Prime Minister Koizumi in the 2000s can bring up the LDP's support. And an unpopular prime minister like Prime Minister Mori, who succeeded Koizumi, can bring down the party's reputation. And the party's like kind of stability may fluctuate, or their baseline popularity may fluctuate based on those personalities. Overall, the party support for the LDP is only about 30%, and that hasn't changed much. So that would be like the core of LDP voters. The fact that Kishida is at 16% support now means he's struggling to win over half of the hardcore LDP supporters. If they changed the leadership or did something to at least show the appearance of reform, then that might be able to help the LDP recover that that loss. That help to answer your?
I was just wondering if there was any indication on where that trust for the LDP comes from. Is it the fact that they're the history of being able to handle certain situations well, and that kind of brings up their trust levels, or if it's just because being the fact that the LDP was such a dominant party, it's just something that the people are kind of used to. Yeah. There's not really a desire to deviate from what would be norm.
It's a great question. So trust is like this ubiquitous term in social science research that's also like really murky, right? Like, what does trust mean? Where does it come from? If we were to do this experiment again, we included like a battery of all these different things. We put trust in there because we thought it might be important. But if we were to do this experiment again, we might add some additional questions where trust is the outcome variable, and trying to explain where does that trust come from? Is it about, if it's about delivering on promises or steering the economy, that's very different from trust that's based in like being honest or of good character. And so we don't know exactly what's driving that trust. We just know that the people who report trusting the LDP most are likely to forego their policy preferences in favor of the LDP when given that kind of choice.
So I was wondering if one reason you're seeing the trust play and valence play such a important role in vote choice in Japan is because the issues are not polarizing enough to drive people to be attached to parties. So in the US, for example, abortion is an issue which is so polarizing that it drives many people to be attached to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. Providing health insurance for all is important enough that it drives some people, and I would frame it more neutrally, towards different parties. And whereas in Japan, you change the, between the LDP and the DPJ, you're not changing the foreign policy, you're still allied to the United States. You're not changing economic policy in any substantial way. They all support health, national health insurance. So the possibility is because the issues are not that polarizing, people end up saying, okay, who's competent and who will just run the government?
It won't be the end of the world. If
Yeah,
we-
right.
Yeah, so the most polarized issue, because we can disaggregate these issue by issue and look at like the variance and support on different issues.
It's a combination of polarizing and how vital people consider it to be.
Yeah, so that's captured by the multidimensional nature of this
Yeah.
experiment. What we find is, so the most polarizing issues are what you might expect, the US-Japan Security Alliance and Article 9. Those are very polarized issues. The problem is that the extreme left and everybody else, although they're polarized, the left doesn't have very many voters left in it. So they may feel very strongly about protecting Article 9 of the Constitution and being against the US-Japan Security Alliance. But that's like JCP supporters who are capturing like 10% of the vote less. So it's like very marginalized polarization. It's not like issues that are polarized in the United States where it is like 50-50. There's some like room for movement on the margins. The other issue that's polarized is nuclear power. And this could have been an area where the LDP could lose support because their positions out of step with the opposition party's positions on nuclear power plants, and voters have strong opinions about that. But that hasn't really worked in the opposition's favor in the past few years. I don't know why that is. Where I might be optimistic about Japanese politics and the range of options that they provide to voters is, as you mentioned, in the past, there wasn't a whole lot of disagreement on domestic policy issues. The main cleavage was security issues, related to the US and the Constitution. And in 2021, it was the first election that I know of, at least, where the main party of the left, the Constitutional Democratic Party, offered an alternative vision on social policies. So the LDP was opposed to same-sex marriage and separate surnames. The left was saying we want ability for same-sex marriage and for women to be able to keep their maiden names when they get married. And this is a very clear divide on social issues that didn't really exist, or at least wasn't part of election contests. It wasn't something that parties were debating in election contests. And so to the extent that the opposition may be able to present a different vision rather than just an echo of domestic policies, that may be an area where healthy cleavages, I should say, can emerge in political debate. So I don't want to say that Japan should become more polarized. This is not a good thing. A lot of people say it's kind of nice that Japan has escaped this polarization that's plagued other advanced industrialized democracies. But to the extent that real contestation over Japan's future can occur, there is a different vision on domestic issues proposed by the LDP and proposed by the opposition party, even if they agree on things like the security relationship.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. I'd like to learn a little bit more about how you gathered your data and, what the survey data was coming from and how you gather it digitally. How did you know who was in it? And how does that kind of shape?
It's a good question. I didn't go into too much detail on it because I didn't want to, some people might not be interested.
No, I know. I mean, it's like, I think it's really interesting. Yeah.
We used a company called Qualtrics that is they build a survey platform. And a lot of these experiments called conjoint experiments are done through Qualtrics. You can design them in Qualtrics, and then you can randomize the attributes that are going to populate these tables that we showed pretty simply. And then Qualtrics is not they don't have their own pool of respondents in Japan. They're not a Japanese company. They operate globally, but they partner with Japanese firms like Rakuten and others to get people into the pool of respondents. And so we tell them what our ideal sample would look like in terms of its distribution on gender and age and income and so on. And then they'll set quotas and they'll reach out to their partners at various firms and get people who match those demographic quotas and invite them to take the survey, and then it starts filling up. And when we reach a quota, then they say no more people who fit that characteristic. So we get a kind of roughly representative sample. It's not a pure probability sample. It's not like calling people at random, but it looks like the population at large. And in the
And people
2000,
get a small payment for completing the survey?
yeah, it depends on who they're getting the information from. It might be like 10 points.
Okay.
Or like,
Interesting.
Amazon like credits or something like that. But it's not a ton of money. We pay about $5 per respondent. And then Qualtrics takes a chunk of that, and then the local firm takes a chunk of that, and then the respondent gets a probably vanishingly small chunk of it, to be honest.
$50,000.
Over the course of 2 big samples, something like that.
So could I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
Is there, as a result of that, a kind of socioeconomic demographic bias?
It's very hard to get very elderly respondents because this is an online survey experiment. And so Japan has an aging society, and many of the people who are vibrantly active voters in their like 70s are not going to be responding to invitations to do online surveys. And so there's going to be a little bit of a bias towards younger voters' preferences. So we actually set our quotas, rather than setting them at like 80 and above, 70 above, we do like 65 and above.
Oh, okay.
So we get a population of respondents in our sample that are representative of that share of the population, but it's going to be closer to 65-year-olds than to like 80-year-olds, just because of the way that people.
So when you talk about having the demographic kind of element of that, were there any correlations between age, gender, and all those demographics between like the kind of trust you were seeing in the later slides, or like was it kind of genuinely across the board, no matter any of those demographic factors, there was like a lot of trust in that?
Yeah, so we've done some interesting like exploratory analysis of these different demographic attributes and what their preferences are. One thing that comes out is you might be surprised that in Japan, the voters who have more liberal preferences, so they're more likely to support the parties of the left, are not younger voters. They're actually older voters. They're people in their 60s, and it's because they came of age in like protest movements of the 1960s. And so the most ardent supporters of the left parties are like elderly at this point. And actually if only voters under the age of 30 had voted in 2021, the LDP would have won more seats than it actually did. So younger population, who's only really in their life as voters, only really experienced government under Abe and his successors. Or if they experienced government before Abe, it was the disastrous time of the DPJ in office. That's their context. And so younger voters are actually more conservative in their voter preferences. But they're not conservative in their policy preferences. So younger voters are going to be in favor of same-sex marriage and separate surnames for couples. They're voting for the LDP because of this Valence advantage. So it's kind of an interesting puzzle. The older voters are much more likely to be liberal, which is not what you think about. Usually voters are more conservative as they age. In Japan, that's not the population pyramid, or how the population pyramid maps onto ideology.
I have one final question. Yeah, so I think this idea, so you mentioned the fuzziness of trust, and some of the things that I think we've been like touching around upon in a lot of the questions are, is it that there's so much trust in the LDP, or is it that there's fear of the alternative?
Yeah.
And so I was wondering like how you guys thought about that, and if that was something that you considered. And
yeah, so we asked the same questions about so here I put up trust in LDP and trust in Ishida. We asked the exact same questions, but about the other parties and the other party leaders. So
Okay.
we framed this as sort of positive trust in the
Yeah.
LDP. But we could show this plot in terms of negative trust for the CDP or the Communist Party or whatever, and trust or negative trust in the party leaders. In general, if you look at these kind of trust scores, the JCP has really low trust, Komeito, these are the two parties that have the least amount of trust, but also really diehard supporters among their voters. The trust in the leaders for like Ishin and DPP, Democratic Party for the People, and the Constitutional Democratic Party, there's kind of like fine trust in the leaders, and in some cases, parallels trust in LDP's leaders. Like leaders are not particularly like, they don't stand out as like wonderful. You see this with like Kishida here, that's not being significant. It's the party as like the governing party that stands out, and the opposition parties, they just don't like, rise to the same level. But we didn't ask about, we only asked like, not very trustworthy, most untrustworthy. You can see that like that drop off in like mostly untrustworthy, that starts to happen at like CDP on the left. But like DPP and Ishin, there's not like extreme negative partisanship there. It's similar to the share that has extreme negative partisanship for the extreme negative trust for the LDP. Yeah, thanks.
We do have time for one more question since you didn't get to ask, please.
Right, thank you then. I want to ask whether you think the trust of LDP a long-lasting variable or a variable that fluctuates?
Yeah, I think it fluctuates. We only measure it at one point in time, and that's sort of a downside of like this particular experiment. We didn't ask the question in the 2017 experiment. There are kind of national surveys that happen every time there's an election that ask trust questions, and so you could look at this. It tends to be more stable for the party than it is for the leader.
Right.
And I think that as you get closer to elections, which is when these surveys often happen, party anticipates the election, and so they do things like switching out their party leader that will help to improve their trust. And so there's a lot more volatility between elections than there is election to election. So the LDP's advantage maybe also stems from its ability to strategically call
Yeah.
when their trust is highest.
Right.
If they run out the clock, the next election has to happen in 2025. If they run out the clock, then they can't do anything about it. They can try to change their party leader as they did in 2021. But if they, if they run out of these tricks to improve their valence or trust attributes for an election, then they're kind of stuck with what the voters